Greetings, dear friends. I present to your attention the most common malfunctions and breakdowns that occur on the Volvo S60. The front suspension is quite strong and simple. The ball and silent blocks are replaceable here, although not cheap in the original. With correct assembly and pulling under load, the rear bushing of the front arm and the stabilizer bar first of all fail. Balls are used less often. After 150 to 200,000 mileage, it is usually necessary to replace the strut supports, bearings, spring buffer. The nuisance is that the bearing support plate on cars after 2004 is not painted and rusts very much, and its shape has also changed. It collects dirt on the upper plane, which contributes to corrosion both of the suspension cup and the plate itself. When using a high-quality non-original, the cost of repairs is low, but if you install only OEM, then the price will make even fans of the fresh German premium nervous. Lever 120 euros, ball 50 euros, a set of strut support and a shock absorber for another 200. You also need to remember to change the top frame struts, they serve about 200,000 maximum. But in comparison with the cost of expenditure and work in the rear suspension, these are trifles. Volvo has its own rear multi-link, original as many as 4 levers per side. At first glance everything is fine. All the bushings are replaceable. The resource of the entire structure was more than 100,000 before the first major repairs. In fact, there are not so many high-quality non-original. The suspension does not like overloads very much, and even the massive aluminum subframe corrodes at the attachment points, eventually becoming unusable, and the springs are frankly weak. And the silent blocks, although replaceable, are 9 pieces on each side, and they cost 20 to 30 euros per piece, if you take OEM. The break-up bolt will surely thaw, and the rest of the fasteners are also not eternal. For cars operated in regions with high humidity and an abundance of salt on the roads, and this is not only Petersburg and Moscow, the rear lower bearing arm can rot at the points of the spring installation up to the formation of fistulas. We also add here the need to tighten and reassemble the suspension only under load and a bunch of assembly nuances. The manufacturer offers dealers to buy a bunch of special tools, without which it is difficult to assemble the suspension correctly on the lift. So that the springs do not fly out, when replacing it is necessary to load the suspension with a hydro resistant, controlling the deflection of the springs before tightening. I hope now you understand why this generation of Volvo suspension does not go very long after repairs, and they take a lot of money for repairs. There are also quite a few cars equipped with Monroe's 4C suspension. This was an option available on a high-end trim. The shock absorbers of such a suspension have an electro valve controlled by a separate block. In addition to the extra blocks and wiring, the shock absorbers themselves are 3 times more expensive than conventional ones, no longer 120 euros, but more than 300 euros, and there are no non-original ones. And if it's not a collectible car, then usually the system no longer works. Volvo has traditionally been unlucky with racks. It seems like a regular power steering, ZF and SMI rails. It is impossible to unequivocally determine which one is where, and it is impossible they're interchangeable. But for some reason the breakdowns are regular. On the SMI rails, the pressure spring of the cracker is corroded, although it is not clear where the water comes from. Replacing the spring usually solves the knock problem. Less often, replacement of side bushings and oil seals is required. Fortunately, there are repair-reinforced oil seals, and all operations are carried out without removing the rail from the machine. True, there is a chance to scratch the rack shaft if it is carefully executed. It is more difficult with ZF rails. In addition to problems with side bushings, they often break the input shaft itself and override the oil seal seats on it. The location of the rail is not very good. Dirt flies and accumulates on the valve body, causing corrosion of the body and tubes. As a result, repairs or even replacements of the rail for the owner of the S60 are commonplace. Every few years something must happen, either a leak or a knock, and then it all depends on what and how the rail was repaired earlier. While there are chances to find a steel leaf rail for a price less than the cost of repair, but this is temporary. If you decide to repair, then rods and shafts on rails of all types are on sale on our own Chinese website. When restoring on a Tongni basis in a hydraulic service, these same parts usually cost exactly an order of magnitude more expensive. In conclusion, to the problems of the rack we add backlash and biting of the cardan joint, the knock of the steering column and the freezing mechanism of the steering lock. In general, there is unexpectedly a lot of hassle due to the steering. Leaking oil seals of the box, as well as the bevel gear and the rear axle on all-wheel drive versions, unfortunately, are a traditional problem, but easily curable. CV joints serve for a long time, but damage to the antennas occurs relatively often. The original drives are supplied only as an assembly, but in fact it is not a problem to replace the external CV joints. There is enough non-original, but the internal ones are more difficult to pick up. Cross codes are usually erroneous. A bunch of electronics catalogs show in the compatibility list the CV joints themselves, and the tripod plugs are generally of the wrong size. The good news, there are still suitable ones, but if you want to quickly and reliably, it's easy to take a whole used drive. If there is a clank when starting from a place or when turning on D in the automatic transmission, then check the tightening of the hub bolts and the condition of the splines. The bolts are unscrewed and the splines are slightly broken. There are several types of mechanical boxes. First of all, these are the 5-speed M56 and M58 or the 6-speed M66, which Getrag made for Ford. The 6-speed M66, which was installed on diesel cars with a capacity of 160 horsepower, and the most powerful gasoline versions with a supercharger, is quite strong. With runs over 200 or very high regular loads, the bearings fail, and if it is not time to change the oil and load on the track, the 6th gear is also added. But overall, the box is pretty solid. Of its minuses, it is on the Volvo S60 that there is an unsuccessful clutch with a very small resource. It runs 30 to 50,000 and the dual mass flywheel also serves a little. The price of these boxes really bites. Good all-wheel drive options cost more than 500 euros, and they are in short supply, since the most common problem is the destruction of the splines and the bevel gear and the box in the all-wheel drive versions. The M56 or M58 series boxes are old manual gearboxes of Volvo's own design, and in general they are even more reliable than the M66. Bearings last longer, except that the synchronizers are weak. They are changed every 180 to 200,000 for normal operation. Well, with 400 plus mileage, you won't see such numbers on the odometer, but there are plenty of cars with such real mileage. The gearbox starts crunching when shifting due to knockdown walking teeth of couplings and gears. Curiously, this is also being repaired. They simply grind the teeth of the couplings to create a normal sharp profile. Worn out fork pads also need to be replaced with such runs. The boxes are not cheap to repair. If you take new parts, the set of synchronizers will come out more than 250 euros, and the shafts and couplings are even more expensive. But on the other hand, buying a used Leaf 1 is not a problem. You can even find a reinforced M59 from a Volvo 850 T5R. The most widespread M56 cost 120 to 150 euros in normal condition. And the last plus, the flywheel for the boxes is ordinary, not dual mass. True, there is no choice of particularly powerful clutches, so for someone this is a reason to change the gearbox to a 6-speed one. Automatic transmissions for the first generation S60 were offered in two types: 5-speed ISIN AW55-50 and their improved versions AW55-51SN and 6-speed ISIN TF80SC, which appeared after restyling and only on diesel engines. In both cases, Volvo acted as the main customer for the AKP project from the Japanese and received boxes earlier than competitors had them, and at the same time received boxes with their own specific valve body. All 5-stage units work with oil cooling in a standard radiator heat exchanger, and cars of all years of production have had problems with the ingress of antifreeze into the oil. Fortunately rare. For 6 motors, cooling is realized through a heat exchanger already on the automatic gearbox itself. The efficiency of the cooling system is, in any case, rather low. All types of boxes on the S60 in the summer in the city are easily heated to temperatures above 100 to 115 degrees. 5-speed automatic transmissions of the 55-50 and 51-51 series differ primarily in the valve body. In the latter, it is more reliable and knows how to change gears in manual mode, and the mechanical part is also slightly modified. The main problems with these automatic transmissions are associated with wear of the channels of the plate and valve body solenoids, as a result of working on dirty oil. All linear solenoids are especially affected. There are not so many of them in the box. 3 pieces: SLT, adjusting the total working pressure; SLU, adjusting the lockup pressure of the torque converter, GTC; and SLS, adjusting the switching pressure. First of all, it is the last one that wears out. Typical problem at Volvo is piston pressure leaks due to systematic overheating. The wear of the C1 or C2 drum seals adds a few problems. If you do not eliminate problems in the form of jolts immediately, then there is wear of the bushings, bumps on the surface of drums 4 out of 5 and 1 out of 2, or reverse, breakage of retaining rings, burning of clutches and brake band, as well as pump wear. Failures of the mechanical part are almost always associated with overloading due to the failure of the electro-hydraulic unit and the decrease in operating pressure and the ingress of wear products into the box. Well, if you take a few steps back, then the cause of valve body wear, oil contamination and pressure drop is the wear of the blocking linings of the gas turbine engine and the subsequent contamination of the internal filter of the box. The blocking algorithms here allow him to work with sliding blocking, especially in earlier versions of the box, which negatively affects his resource. Fortunately, these boxes are currently well mastered in repair and are quite simple even for self-bulkheading, since there are valve body repair kits and mechanics. But any version of the automatic transmission is afraid of overheating and dirty oil, so it must be changed very often, every 30 to 40,000 kilometers. Additionally, it is advisable to put an external filter in the oil cooling system and a large radiator. This will reduce the operating temperature from 100 to 115 degrees to a safe 70 to 90. Unfortunately, with a standard cooling system and without frequent oil changes, 5 motors cooled have a maximum of 120 and 180,000 kilometers. It seems not so bad, but with regular service they run much longer and more stable. Now most of the boxes have undergone at least one repair, and it is not the absolute mileage that is important, but the quality of the repair and the operating conditions after. The 6-speed automatic transmission TF80SC differs significantly from the 5-speed automatic transmission both hydraulically and mechanically. The latter has become stronger, it tolerates impacts and other problems better to the valve body breakdowns. The rate of oil contamination with wear products of the blocking linings of the gas turbine engine in a 6 motor, all other things being equal, is lower. And yet, the problems in general for the box are the same, but they appear with high mileage. Oil contamination with wear products of the gas turbine engine leads to damage to the valve body, which already independently finishes the mechanical part due to a critical decrease in pressure. True, On the TF80SC there was also a problem with the rapid wear of the blocking linings of the gas turbine engine. Some racers wore them out to the mileage of 120,000, and along the way the bearing failed, which immediately caused problems with the rotation of the oil pump sleeve. An additional new problem was the C1 drum shaft seals, the Teflon rings of which wore out quickly enough in dirty oil. After 150,000, a pressure leak in this unit could threaten the normal operation of the box. In 2015, new rings with a lock appeared on the market, which did not allow a rapid loss of pressure during wear. Additionally, it is worth noticing that if you change the oil, you need to fill in either the original Toyota WS or select the better one, but with the same viscosity. Less viscous oils are contraindicated for new types of TF80SC boxes. The valve body of the 6-speed gearbox has become much more complex than that of the 5-speed motor, and testing at the stand reveals problems not so reliably. In addition, it is worth noting that it is quite difficult to find a service station that will diagnose the TF80SC. iSyn, unlike ZF, does not have branded services in Russia, and wide-profile boxes do not have any stands and will recommend that you change everything. But there is good news. The valve body can be supplied, for example from the Land Rover Freelander 2. It fits on this box without any problems and is much more reliable than the Volvo one. All-wheel drive cars traditionally have more trouble. As already mentioned above, the splines of the gearbox and bevel gear are often cut off, and the bushing is sore. Often it cannot be removed from the differential axle even with a press. It is good if the combination of the press with heating helps, but sometimes only the grinder saves. Most often, that acidification occurs on cars with a Ford M66, where the shafts are made of something that quickly rusts when moisture is exposed. Shafts are better on IC. The Volvo S60 model was equipped only with engines from Volvo's own modular engine line, Petrol and Diesel. At the time of the release of the S60, it was already a fairly proven series. It debuted on the 850 model, so there are no sharp fashionable solutions here. In general, the modular engine series is modular, which includes motors from 4 to 6 cylinders, but on the S60 there are only 5-cylinder options. All motors are in an unfilled aluminum block with cast iron sleeves. The cylinder head on the S60 versions is strictly 20 valve, timing drive belt. All versions of gasoline engine have one phase regulator, and on almost all versions after restyling there are already 2 phase regulators. Hydraulic compensators in the valve drive are available only on diesel engines. Gasoline ones do not, although they were on all the engines of the series, including 20 valve ones. Thermostats are common, unregulated, everywhere. The intake manifolds are relatively simple, although on second-generation diesel engines and some gasoline engines, after restyling there are even variable geometry flaps, as in principle everything else. All motors have a very poor timing design. The timing belt itself and the rollers are quite reliable, but the drive belt of the auxiliary units, when stratified, almost with guarantee tightens under the timing belt, since the design of the crankshaft pulley and the casing does not interfere with such development of events. Owners often install a belt guard or knife, a bracket that prevents fragments from falling under the timing belt, or they upgrade the pulley and casing for the same purpose by installing a protection plate. All motors of the series are quite hot, even diesel ones, and they do not like overheating very much. The slightest overheating, and immediately there is a skew of the cylinder head covers, the cylinder head itself, and with more serious ones, at the same time the crankshaft bed. There are no gaskets between the main components of the engine. All the covers are functional, even the crankcase of the block. There is an oil intake in it, and at the junction with the block there are crankshaft lubrication channels. The design was in many ways ahead of its time. In the 90s, It was simply fantastic. It is interesting that the motors are assembled almost without fittings, all on classic clamps, and all the rubber bands here are inexpensive. Even if the quality turned out to be not very good, you can always change it inexpensively for about 30 euros a piece, except for the pipes or the heater. The radiators are almost all weak. The air conditioner condenser peels off a lot, losing honeycombs, the space between it and the main radiator gets clogged very easily. The turbocharged versions have a sandwich, a cassette of 3 radiators which is blown out very badly, gets dirty easily and requires regular flushing. In atmospheric versions, nothing prevents the main radiator from moving inside the engine compartment by a few centimeters in order to improve airflow. At the same time, the resource of the radiator fan could be spared. It costs more than 350 euros in the original, and Bosch, in general, 750. The fan is 8 years old. Further surprises are possible. Instead of replacing the assembly, you can try to get by with replacing the bearings, brushes, and the control unit. For some reason, the block was placed directly on the electric motor. As a result, electrolytic capacitors die on the PWM controller, followed by MOSFETs, and the board is eaten away by the electrolyte. At the same time, moisture gets there, which finishes the soldering of the contacts from the outside. The motor has a very unsuccessful engine manifold. It can get up even with a whole regulator. It's useless to climb there without skillful hands. Guess why the fan is put on in case of a breakdown in Russia? That's right, from Shniva. In comparison with the cheapest non-original for 170 euros, it is more powerful and more reliable. Well, complex electronics are changed for a couple of relays. The fan error is ignored. All motors have certain difficulties with the operation of the VKG system. With age, the oil trap located under the manifold intake becomes clogged and the engine begins to sweat, with oil over all the gaskets. The oil separator in the lid is also clogged. The drain channel from the oil separator into the block is tightly clogged, and the tubes become lumber, crack and clog, which often leads to rapid oil leakage. In motors with a thin pipe outlet into the air filter housing, this is exactly typical for 2.4, the filter clogs at the same time and the DRV quickly sits down. It needs to be constantly cleaned, since the Denso design is cleaned with a bang. But the Bosch sensor dies much more reliably. It cannot be cleaned with solvents, but the inexpensive analog from the VIZ perfectly fits in its space and has a pleasant side property. The VKG system on 2.5T engines with such a sensor does not pollute the intake as much as with its own. The lubrication system has a very fine mesh on the oil intake, and dirt in the crankcase often leads to oil starvation, so you need to be careful when changing the oil after careless owners and generally change it more often. Another small is related to thermostats. For some reason they do not run much problem on this engine, although the design seems to be quite typical. Perhaps the shape of the thermostat housing on motors before restyling contributes to the skew of the base relative to the axis, but on cars after restyling the shape of the body has changed, and the problems remained the same. Another specific support is related to the duration of the manufacturer's support. Even in spite of the premium quality and the high price of spare parts, many actual parts are simply not on sale or appear in it from time to time. This is largely due to Russian peculiarities, but still unpleasant. In the USA, the dealer service offers original elements even for such old-school models as the P1800 and 850 with a minimum delivery time and at a very up-to-date price. But in our country they just shrug their shoulders, even at extremely inflated prices. The line of 5-cylinder engines on the S60 is presented mainly in the 2.4-liter version. The most massive engines on the S60 are atmospheric 2.4 with a capacity of 140 and 170 HP, B5244S2 and B5244S respectively. The mechanical part is exactly the same, including the calm shafts. The phase regulator is only on the intake shaft. Occasionally, you come across versions of the engine under the Californian economy standards B5244S6, They differ in a hotter thermostat as a result of the worse condition at attachments, a completely different ventilation system for fuel vapors, but mechanically the differences are minimal, except that the tubes and gaskets are different. These are very good motors, high torque and unpretentious. To all the aforementioned general problems of the series, you can add phase regulator valve leaks. The oil from it easily gets just on the belt of additional units, and the design with one piston and a screw mechanism is prone to leaks and is expensive. At the same time, the phase regulator is quite expensive, from 220 to 320 euros, and their replacement greatly increases the price of replacing the timing belt in the end. Oil contamination around the belt guard indicates that owners are saving on either clutch costs or replacing clutch control valves. It is not recommended to install cheap belts, only HNBR or SNH, made of highly saturated nitrile butadiene rubber, which are not afraid of oil, well or reinforced versions in PTFE film from diesel versions. With runs of 250 plus and the rail oil change, the motors are prone to an increase in oil appetite. The piston coke and the valve stem seals and oil seals wear out. Consumables change, and the piston rings can be returned to mobility by the coking. The oil pump in motors with a good margin of performance but with high millage, there are cases of failing of the pressure reducing valve. You need to monitor the pressure, at least listen to knocks and look closely at the emergency pressure lamp, oiler. By the way, if the ill-fated BKG mentioned above does not work well, then foam and emulsion may form in the crankcase. They wash away carbon deposits in pieces, which can also lead to a drop in oil pressure due to contamination of the oil intake mesh. The version up to 2004 inclusive had a Magneti Marelli electric throttle of types 8644-347 and 8644-344. It has two problems: leaks along the damper axis, which is not very significant, and wear-resistant damper position sensors and their current collectors. It also happens that the capacitor in the choke power circuit fails, but much less often sensor breakdowns. The rest of the throttle is quite reliable, but the discrepancy between the readings of the sensors makes the idlers unstable and the thrust jerky. With new firmware of the engine blocks it is not so bad, but with the old car it is extremely unpleasant. In theory, the chokes can be repaired. The cover with the sensors is removed, the sensors themselves and current collectors can be replaced with parts from Fiat chokes with low millage. There are many used and they are cheap. Sometimes rinsing and cleaning is enough to bring the throttle back to life. You can also replace it with, again, Snivovsky TPS if your hands are well hung. You can buy a new choke, but the price is 13T Turbocharged. It may differ slightly by year of release, but in general it has not changed. VKG is a little more complicated, but the same choke from Magneti Marelli, and in general it is a good motor. But remember, I mentioned the dimension of the piston group. These engines have an 83mm piston and a very thin baffle between the cylinders. On runs over 100 on non-standard boost pressure, there is always a chance that the thin partition between the out cylinders will crack. At first, a crack usually appears in the aluminum base, then it goes through the cast iron and eventually breaks through the cylinder head gasket. Reloading is possible, but there is a high likelihood that a regular liner will cause further destruction of the block. Installation of sleeves with the shoulder in the hook and our high creativity is usually economically inexpedient. Cylinder blocks are still inexpensive and widely available, but resellers often simply change the cylinder's head gasket. In this form, the engine can stretch a couple of thousand kilometers, so pay attention to the recent work on the cylinder head. In principle, motors can travel many hundreds of thousands of kilometers before overhaul, but the risk of cracking is always preserved, and overheating, detonation and blowout become unambiguous prerequisites for it. Pouring bad gasoline, not monitoring the temperature, driving with a faulty throttle valve and not changing the boost pressure control valve is highly discouraged. The valve costs 55 euros in the original and 30 with a small one in the version from Peer Book. you should not save. Engines 2.5T, B5254T2, which by code and designation have a volume of 2.5 liters, in fact have the same dimension 83x90 and the same 2435 cubic meters of volume. The main changes in comparison with the 2.4T engine are the new Mitsubishi TD04L 14T turbine instead of the 13T. It has a larger compressor wheel and less hot one, and the throttle is already Bosch. The power is a little more, and tuning for these motors is more common. So problems with the liners occur more often, but it is hardly the fault of the block. It is the same. The B5254T4 engine on the S60R also has a piston engine of 83 mm and differs from the weaker ones by an already reinforced piston engine with a reduced compression ratio and an increased performance intercooler. The turbine here is already a TD04L19T, and there are actually two intercoolers, and they are taken out of the sandwich of radiators. The engine's boost potential is excellent, but liner cracks are no longer a rare, albeit expected nuisance, but a constant threat. If you are afraid of problems with liners, then the S60 has supercharged engines with an 51mm piston. They have no problems with liners at all, and they sulk much better, but they are less common on the T5 versions 2.3 and 2.4 and 2.0T. It is these engines that have forged the glory of Volvo engines as superbly boosted. The B5244T5 engine with a volume of 2.4 liters with dimensions 81x93.2 mm, or the legendary 2.3 B5234T3 with dimensions 81x90 mm from the T5 versions have much greater potential and at the same time is much more reliable. Still rare B5204T5 with a volume of 2.0 liters and dimensions 81x77 mm also have no problems with high boost pressure, but are not very popular for civilian tuning. Diesel engines on the S60 are of our own design, as well as gasoline engines from the modular engine series. Until 2005, the first generation of motors was installed, and after that, the second. The block and cylinder head are almost the same. The difference is in the design of the intake manifold and the turbine control system. In the first generation, the turbine is controlled in a classical way, a vacuum-driven geometry, and the intake manifold is simple, without dampers. In the second generation, the turbine is already with an electric geometry drive, and the intake manifold has received spiral flaps, conventional electromagnetic injectors, common rail power system. On the first generation, Bosch fuel equipment did not even require binding injectors. There was only ranking by class, which greatly facilitates maintenance of the engine outside the dealer service. True, it was the reliability of the injectors and the weak EGR valve that were its main problem. In the second generation, the nozzles serve much more reliably, but in addition to the capricious EGR, particulate filters have appeared, which in Volvo, during purely urban operation, are easily clogged. The turbines received an expensive and capricious electric drive of the actuator, and what is completely unpleasant, changes in the drive of the mounted units led to the fact that the problem with the breakage of the drive belt of the auxiliary units in these motors began to occur many times more often. Another unpleasant problem of second-generation diesel engines is associated with the emerging vortex flaps in the intake manifold. The axle broke and the flaps flew away. Pressure was leaking through the axle. The axle itself was cocked with soot from the intake because the EGR worked very aggressively. True, this is just the smallest of the problems. It is easy to check the damper for wedging. Fortunately, the drive rod is located just near the timing cover and the front side. Removing the flaps is also elementary. Plugs are very cheap. A repair axle with dampers cost about 130 euros, which is also not too expensive. Once every 60 to 100,000 mileage you can afford. Problems with cylinder head gaskets also occur in the first generation, but they are more common in more powerful versions of the second generation engines with a more efficient turbine. The gaskets simply blow through, and a sufficiently long block of cylinders does not like very much even a slight heating. In normal operation, the engine does not heat up even with a tightly clogged radiator. but when driving on a highway for a long time at high speed, it easily catches overheating to 110 to 120 degrees, and this is enough to blow out the weakened cylinder head gasket. The cylinder head usually does not carry out this, but repairs are in any case not budgetary. In general, these are very resource-intensive units that can go under 500,000 kilometers without overhaul even in Russian conditions, and in Europe they nurture 1,000,000. The situation is complicated a little by the unequalness and cost of the components, but such is the price of originality. On this, information about the problems of the Volvo S60 is exhausted. If you know more or do not agree with what you heard, I'm waiting for you in the comments.